later. But just to introduce Martine, Martine took her first degree in English literature, where in-depth studies on the works of Oscar Wilde led her to an interest in theology. Interesting. She said one day she would like to write on Wilde. She thinks that we've got him quite badly wrong, or modern times have. I think your thesis was on his fairy tales?
No, I can't remember now. It's such a long time ago. No, it was on... it was a bit like the unmasking of Oscar Wilde.
Right.
Looking at.
Yeah, sort of the idea of perfection spoiled continuously. That was the theme. She subsequently went on to study theology at Heathrop, the University of London, completing her master's in theology. This was after her English literature. She developed a great love for Chesterton from her father and my father, I must say, because that's where much of mine came from, as Bishop Peter knows, which led her to study GK's theology in depth. She's this year completed her doctoral thesis entitled G.K. Chesterton's Concept of Holiness in the Ordinary. She's just doing her amendments, with particular focus upon his use of rhetoric, literary devices, and original forms of provoking the imagination in order to convey abstract theological concepts. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful. So, Martine Thompson.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. And please let me know if you can't hear me very well. I haven't got the loudest voice in the world, so tell me. The title of my talk is actually a little bit longer than it is in the programme because I couldn't fit it on. It's actually Glory to God in the Lowest, a Religion of Little Things. That was a poem of Chesterton's. Now, the title of this talk is, of course, a paradox, and very fitting as we are speaking of Chesterton, the great maker of paradoxes. And that perhaps overused description of him is said as if this was some device, some use of wit, designed purely to entertain. Chesterton, of course, is very famous, or even as suggested, considered notorious by some for his use of paradox. And there have been some scholarly studies undertaken in this area. Hugh Kenner, in his Paradox in Chesterton, is one of the first to put forward the argument that this technique was not used by Chesterton purely as a kind of etymological or literary gymnastics for our or even his own entertainment or amusement. A paradox is, as defined by the Oxford English Dictionary, a statement or proposition which, despite apparently sound reasoning from acceptable premises, leads to a conclusion that seems logically unacceptable or self-contradictory. Chesterton desired his readers to see and knew the world around them, so he used paradox to help people perceive, as he did, what lay hidden behind the world, the providence that had made him. Kenner's study suggests that we should be discerning when looking for meaning in Chesterton, that we should, as it were, sort out the simply frivolous and transient in his writing from the important metaphysical intuition. I would suggest, however, that Chesterton was very rarely frivolous, a charge made against him from the very beginning. In answer to a formidable opponent, Mr. McCabe, which is always worth quoting again, he said, "Mr. McCabe thinks that I am not serious, but only funny, because Mr. McCabe thinks that funny is the opposite of serious. Funny is the opposite of not funny, and of nothing else. The truth is that the two qualities of fun and seriousness have nothing whatever to do with each other. They are no more comparable than black or triangular. Mr. Bernard Shaw is funny and sincere. Mr. George Roby is funny and not sincere. Mr. McCabe is sincere and not funny. The average cabinet minister is not sincere and not funny." So what appeared to be frivolity was yet another technique in his teaching armoury. another form of what Belloc termed parallelism in Chesterton. I believe it is of crucial importance that Chesterton should not be misunderstood as an artist who simply plays with language, but rather an artist who saw the paradoxical nature of the world, and because of its multiple mysteries, was forced to use paradox as the only form of language which could convey sufficiently the very mysteries he perceived. One of the main doctrinal paradoxes at the heart of Christianity, and which Chesterton wrote upon profusely, was the way in which God chose to become incarnate. That is, how the all-powerful creator of heaven and earth becomes a tiny, totally dependent human baby, powerless to look after himself. Chesterton states, "A mass of legend and literature, which increases and will never end, has repeated and rung the changes on that single paradox, that the hands that had made the sun and stars were too small to reach the huge heads of the cattle." We all know at Christmas that God becomes a baby, but what Chesterton cleverly does is dramatises the fact through his literary skill, so that it becomes new again and shows the significance and the whole of the lesson of God coming into the world as a helpless and vulnerable child. It is a deliberate highlighting of the importance of growing in humility. I think what is profound here, and what Chesterton perceives, is that Christ's ministry does not begin at 30, when he starts preaching in and around Galilee, but in fact from the very beginning of his life on earth. When Chesterton speaks of the Nativity in poems and in his other writings, it is not a new thing to us. We look repeatedly, annually, at scenes of the Nativity in Christmas cards year on year. But Chesterton, as seems to be his apostolate, seeks to make us look again. A continuous theme throughout his writing, of course. He makes us look at life, at creation, at the world, as if for the very first time, as a child does. For Chesterton knows that we have this propensity to failing sight, a form of creeping blindness, like cataracts forming as we age. This physical image of increasing blindness has its parallel, of course, in spiritual blindness. Chesterton helps us to see how the incarnation of God into the material world is quite unlike anything else. For Chesterton, it is the crucial event, a piece of good news, but it is good news which seems too good to be true. He emphasizes that it is nothing less than a loud assertion that this mysterious maker of the world has visited his world in person. In The Everlasting Man, Chesterton infers that it is a most unlikely story, an apparent joke, a jest. However, it is only an apparent joke for the scientific critic who cannot see the truth that exists within the paradox. Chesterton explains that since the contrast between the cosmic creation and the little local infancy has in history been repeated, reiterated, underlined, emphasized, exalted in, sung, shouted, roared, there is therefore no need for these higher critics to point out to the Christian that there's something a little odd about the coming of Christ as a poor child. Chesterton explains, however, such critics perceive the Christmas story as odd because they believe the world as not good or fit enough for divinity or sanctity to enter. It is so strange and unusual a story about a hero that no other tale, historical event, or pagan legend can affect us and make such a peculiar and even poignant impression on us than that of the Christ child in Bethlehem. And the reason for this is simply because the birth of a baby does not automatically or instinctively conjure up in our minds images of greatness and hero worship. The story of Bethlehem does not exactly work outwards adventurously to to the wonders to be found at the ends of the earth. God's coming into the world carried higher expectations than the birth of a poor and homeless child. So the expectation of Israel was fulfilled. Only the dream came true in a wholly unexpected manner, not at all in keeping with the idea of a temporal kingdom and king in purple and gold. Chesterton's point is that there were and still are people, as we know, who find difficulty in envisaging this king in poverty, humiliation, and loneliness. So here for Chesterton lies what he names as the revolution of the Incarnation, that the worldly definition and understanding of what is considered to be magnificent was to undergo a complete transformation. He states, "It might be suggested, in a somewhat violent image, that nothing had happened in that fold or crack in the great grey hills, except that the whole universe had been turned inside out. I mean that all the eyes of wonder and worship, which had been turned outward to the largest thing, were now turned inward to the smallest. What the world regards as the largest things, the things regarded with most value, i.e. material wealth, worldly power, high status, physical beauty, things that would perhaps be instinctively related to a god, had become, with the coming of God as a poor child, relegated. And instead, those things which people had once regarded as the smaller things of life, the unimportant, the seemingly mundane, ordinary, and insignificant, were now taught as the things which pertained to true value. For it was through such things that God chose to reveal himself to the world. Thus, as Chesterton suggests, God, who had been only a circumference, was seen as a centre, and a centre is infinitely small. The faith becomes, in more ways than one, a religion of little things. Heaven, therefore, was no longer to be found above and out of reach, as he explains, though men are said to have looked for hell under the earth. In this case, it is rather heaven that is under the earth. What we are being taught here is that the values of heaven are entirely opposite to the values of the world, and the greatest value of heaven, which was found at Bethlehem and remained with Christ throughout his entire life, was the virtue of humility. As Christopher Hollis also notes in his work, The Mind of Chesterton, the important point is that to Chesterton, pride, the sin of Lucifer, was the arch sin, and humility, the virtue of Christ, was the arch virtue. The one original virtue which Christianity brought into the world, the virtue that had never previously been suspected as a virtue, was humility. Chesterton does suggest that such a revolutionary change in people's perception of God, however, was in a sense the difficulty of a new dimension. He argues that perhaps the event in Bethlehem would have been a little easier to come to terms with if Christ had been born on the level of the world, among those who, being in the public eye, could more easily make Christ known to the world, more than the poorer and insignificant people of society. But instead, God chose to come into creation and enter a place that was even lower than the world. He states, the first act of the divine drama was enacted not only on no stage set above the sightseer, but on a dark and curtained stage sunken out of sight. For Christ was born in a cave, a glory in the darkness that was under the hills. This paradoxical vision of the glory in darkness can also be found in a poem he entitled Gloria in Profundis, Glory in the Depths. In this poem, Chesterton highlights the extreme lengths God went to save the fallen world, and he expresses how the falling of the holy and pure Creator into the depths of the world was faster, fiercer, and more extreme than even the fall of Satan, precisely because God had a longer drop to undertake from his perfect heights of sanctity. And it was into such depths of the earth that would make him unrecognizable, even to us, to humanity. This is interesting because suggesting that God has a further to fall than Satan does not make much theological sense. As theology, it is dubious, if not untenable. But that is not the point in Chesterton's writing. It is a dramatic, excessively physical, and imaginative way of thinking about the Incarnation, a literary technique to shock us and snap us out of slumber. In this poem, Chesterton changes the traditional image of the wise men searching the skies for the Star of Bethlehem. He emphasizes the humility of the almighty drop of God into the world by averting our eyes away from the sky and forcing us to search for him on or even below the ground. The cave is such a lowly place to enter into creation. Chesterton here seems to recognize how the intelligent, the educated, wise, are sometimes taken off guard by the weak or ordinary among humanity, by the perception, understanding, and sheer faith of those who have not seen. In his poem, The Wise Men, he emphasizes the idea of the understated and unusually humble hero, and a hero so ordinary that one may miss finding him. Step softly, under snow or rain, to find the place where men can pray. The way is also very plain, that we may lose the way. So very near the manger lies, that we may travel far. Go humbly. It has hailed and snowed, with humble voices low and lanterns lit. So very simple is the road, that we may stray from it. The images of walking in the snow amidst the unique silence that comes with snowfall and using a lantern to lighten our path all enhances the quietness and solitary concentration which is needed to look for our humble God in the world. That the humility of Christ overthrew the worldly power of worldly wise kings is also touched upon in the Everlasting Man. Here, the figure of Herod seems to symbolize for Chesterton what Hollis, as quoted earlier, calls the arch sin of Lucifer, and what Chesterton suggests as the rise of imperial pride into insanity. However, as Herod scored the land of the child, Chesterton points out that there is, in this buried divinity, an idea of undermining the world, of shaking the towers and palaces from below, even as Herod the great king felt that earthquake under him and swayed with his swaying palace. Thus, hidden within the very dugout of an outlaw's den, lay a power stronger than the worldly kingship of Herod, than the pride of the devil. It was for Chesterton, then, the power of divine humility, which lay quietly and peacefully in the body of a newborn child. Paradoxically, a humble and little rebellious power that would overturn the world. That is perhaps the mightiest mystery of the cave. And there follows in this strange story the idea of an upheaval of heaven. That is the paradox of the whole position, that henceforth the highest thing can only work from below. Royalty can only return to its own by a sort of rebellion. Thus, it seems here that royalty was to recover its own position once robbed by an egotistic fallen world, and thus teach anew the divine and saving power of humility and littleness. Speaking upon the subtlety of the virtue of humility, Chesterton states that it is not made of what the world would call strong materials. Rather, it is made of materials whose strength is in that winged levity with which they brush us and pass. Here is an example of the emphasis Chesterton places upon the paradoxical strength of heaven, that what the world perceives as strong, self-pride and social status, is not regarded in the same way in the eyes of God, whereas the strength of heaven lies in that winged levity. reflecting on what Chesterton wrote on the levity of angels in orthodoxy, in fact, as quoted by Pope Benedict, angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. One understands that it is this which Chesterton seems to be referring to again. Heavenly lightness symbolises the virtues of humility, joy, and selflessness. And these virtues are light because they are at the opposite end to the vices of sin, selfishness and pride, and which Christian art and literature has portrayed through the ages to be sunk in the very depths of hell, hence their connection to heaviness. Furthermore, these virtues do not belong to the angels alone, but were found within that humble little holy family of Bethlehem. Chesterton reminds us that these virtues were practiced by Joseph and Mary in their ordinary parental roles and day-to-day duties. They are, therefore, virtues which can be attained by all people, by every family. Although, as Chesterton suggests, because humility is so ordinary, simple and quietly natured, it can often brush us and pass amidst the noise and bustle of everyday life. However, although soft and swift and often unseen, once carried out, these particular little virtues contain the power and strength to create heaven on earth. He states, "It is all that is in us, but a brief tenderness that is there made eternal. All that means no more than a momentary softening, that is in some strange fashion become a strengthening and a repose. It is the broken speech and the lost word that are made positive and suspended unbroken, as the strange kings fade into a far country and the mountains resound no more with the feet of the shepherds, and only the night and the cavern lie in fold upon fold over something more human than humanity." It is, of course, reasonable that one may find such a statement confusing and unclear, leading to a questioning of how it is impossible to become more human than we already are. However, what Chesterton seems to be implying is that the fallen world is not yet as human as it could be, as it was intended to be before the fall. That is, the fallen man or woman is not as human as Christ, simply by lacking humility, goodness, selflessness, and charity. Instead, for Chesterton, the fallen person is less human in their worldly pride and selfishness. Thus, to become more human, it does not, as Chesterton repeatedly reiterated, involve becoming great and popular among men, but to become more like Christ in his holy but unassuming virtues. Chesterton's perception of the Mother of God helps his readers understand how these humanistic themes of the Incarnation can teach of this humility and holiness in the religion of little things. As shown, he highlights the theme of the ordinary circumstances of being born in a cave to poor parents. But he also introduces such tenderness to the figure of God in the fact of Mary. Chesterton's portrayal of Mary, as he understands it from Scripture, emphasises that she is no worldly queen or figure of note in society, but a poor, young, and very ordinary girl, in fact, a near outcast. Thus, by emphasising the ordinariness of Christ's mother, the incarnation of God in the world makes Christ a relatable figure, making holiness more appealing and unattainable to the ordinary person, striving to be Christ-like in their everyday lives. Lastly, if we now look at the significance of the poor for Chesterton in relation to the Christ child, the writer seems very keen to highlight that as a result of God being born as an outcast, there arose a revolutionary change in the way the poor and homeless began to be perceived by society. God sanctified the most ordinary and neglected of people and raised them up. In his book, Charles Dickens, he states that Christianity is the thing that makes the ordinary man feel extraordinary. And equally important, Christianity is the thing that makes the extraordinary man feel ordinary. Chesterton's strong belief in what he termed the royal poor appears to have been the motivation for an immense amount of energy over many years. The poor were not royal in the eyes of the world, but if God, the source and inspiration for what, through history, people have imagined royalty to be in its crown, gold, and glory, instead came into the world as a poor child, consequently, the image of what royalty should really mean changes, and changes radically. As Chesterton stated, the poor become important because they are sacramentally filled with the divine presence of God. And this is a lovely quote, it's one of my favourites. And Christianity, again, is a thing which, by its nature, does not think of men as more or less valuable, but of men as all intensely and painfully valuable. For Christianity, all men are equal, as all pennies are equal, because the only value in any of them is that they bear the image of the King. I'm finishing here, you're probably pleased to know. But do you not think that this concept might have seemed a little radical only a few years ago? But now, with the atmosphere generated by Pope Francis, an exciting Pope, it is becoming familiar again. I'm just trying to quote that I wrote down on Monday. Pope Francis spoke about humility as the path to salvation. In her canticle, Mary does not say she is happy because God was looking to her kindness or to her sweetness, all of them virtues that she possessed. No, because the Lord was looking to her humility, the humility of his servant, her smallness. Thank you.